We're hoping to eventually do some updating on the website. Tiffany has already been working on updating a number of things already if you went on there. As we talk about how do we grow the church, one of the vehicles is going to be that website. When new people will go on and want to watch a service or watch preaching or watch teaching, that's a great vehicle. So anyway, we're hopefully going to get this starting to be streamed live. And that's one reason we moved it in here, as well as kind of to save time. And our goal is to keep the fellowship hall always set up. So it's not tear it down, set it up, tear it down, set it up, tear it down, set it up. Yes, I'm an officer and we look at efficiencies and logistics. And, there's only so many hours volunteers have to do stuff. And, we don't need to be, I don't think, tearing down and setting up. So it'll be set up for like the ladies' retreat and stuff like that as well. Plus, these chairs are a little bit more comfy. There's just a little bit more comfy. I always say the brain can only absorb what the posterior can endure, right? So we all get that. You got that one, did you? So I encourage you as we go into Jeremiah, I'm going to mention it in the morning service, but I encourage people to come to Sunday school. I think this is a great opportunity because this is often a better teaching time. Not that the morning service isn't, but this is a teaching time, and it's also an opportunity for you to ask questions. So I will chase rabbits from here to kingdom come. If you have a question, please ask it. Now don't ask me where Cain got his wife, but if you have some of you don't get the point, but that's kind of, the atheists always say, well, if, how did Cain, if there's only one man and one woman, how did Cain get his wife, Yeah. If God created the gene pool on chromosomes in one man and one woman for an entire race, what we should not do in marrying our sister today was different than how they would marry it then. And isn't it interesting that about 30 years ago they discovered through tracing back in the female line, the mitochondria, that every human came from one woman. That's a 99.9% proven fact by science that every human came from one woman, and they even call her Eve. So anyway, about that as far as asking questions. This is a great opportunity for you to ask questions. So I'm going to do some introduction in the book of Jeremiah this morning. You say, Pastor, why did you pick Jeremiah? Well, first of all, Jeremiah gets kind of overlooked because Jeremiah is a long book, so it's harder to teach through. And if you don't understand the history, you miss the points. If you don't understand where Jeremiah is living and what he's engaged in, you miss the applications for us today. And most people don't. Thirdly, Jeremiah is the longest prophesying prophet in the Old Testament. His ministry is the longest of any of the prophets. Thank you for closing that door. I appreciate that so much. I want everybody to be happy and talk, and I don't want to hear them. So, anyway, he is probably more like in his setting like we are in America than any other of the prophets. And I'll get into it a little bit in the introduction today, but Jeremiah prophesied the first 20 years of his prophecy lifeline was under godly Josiah. When you go back to 2 Kings and you read about Josiah, there was a great revival and they celebrated the Passover like they hadn't celebrated in 400 years. So you think in Israel's history, it's from the time the pilgrims came to America, at that time. By the way, I'll mention it in the morning service. Does anybody know what happened 500? My wife hates me when I do this because I'm a historian, so I'll wake her up and say, guess what happened 600 years ago today? And she's like, I'm sleeping. What are you doing to me? Does anybody know what happened 500 years ago today? Martin Luther stood at the Diet of Worms and said, here I stand, I can do no other. My conscience is bound by Scripture. That was 500 years ago today. So the Reformation We say it started at Wittenberg in 1517 when he posted the 95 Theses, truth to that, but it's actually 4 years later when he is threatened with execution, just like John Huss had been threatened, was murdered 100 years before, that he says, okay, if you're going to burn me at the stake like you did Huss, I can't do anything other than that. And he goes back to Wittenberg. On his way, he's captured by his friends, and he's put in Wartburg Castle. One day I'll show you the pictures of Wartburg Castle. I've been there a couple of different times, and they lock him, basically his friends lock him in a room because there was a death warrant on his life. And it's through that problem that he translates the first Bible into the vernacular of the German people. And it's in this little closet that's still there in Wartburg Castle that you can go and see today, where he gives the German people the Bible in their tongue for the first time ever. So 500 years ago today. So that's my little rabbit that I'm chasing as we get into Jeremiah. Anyway, so Jeremiah, the first 20 years of his life was great. I mean, it would be like, you're in the ministry and thousands of people are coming to Christ, and, the whole nation looks like it's turning to God. Josiah dies, we'll talk about that in a second, in a battle with the Egyptian Pharaoh at Megiddo. So where Christ is going to come back in the valley of Armageddon and Megiddo, that's actually where Josiah dies in 609 BC. Same spot in Israel. And his son then Israel goes back and forth between favoring Egypt and favoring Babylon. And by 586, within 14 and 9, 23 years, Israel is demolished and wiped out, and 1 million Jews die. And Jeremiah lives through all that, and he becomes the renegade because he prophesies to surrender to Babylon, and they didn't want to hear that. And so he experiences great revival in his youth, and in his later years, they attempt to kill him. The nation goes downhill, and they don't want to hear from him anymore. So I think there's some similarities to America's history, isn't there? So part of this that I want you to think about over the next year is, how did Jeremiah respond when everything was good, and how did he respond when everything wasn't so good? Because no other character in the Old Testament had great revivals and then great heresy in his ministry like Jeremiah did. Okay, so I've explained that a little bit to you, but let me see in my notes. Okay. So I will read some stuff that I wrote down. I gave you kind of the overview and a big picture. Now I'm gonna read a little bit to you. So stick with me. So internally, when Jeremiah comes into his place, well, let me just say this. I'm on the wrong page. So Jeremiah's ministry is 5 decades long. I told you it's the longest ever. It starts in about 627 BC. So I don't want to assume things, so I'm not insulting your intelligence, but I also never want to assume something. So we all understand that AD means Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord. So supposedly 0 is when Jesus was born. Jesus was most likely, because the calendars and lunar versus solar, was probably born more like 4 or 5 BC. So Jesus was born before Christ. There's a pun there someplace. There's a joke there. He was born, because BC stands for before Christ, right? So my Jewish friends will say CE, Christian era. So you can tell if you're talking to a Jewish, and I have Jewish friends, they will not say AD, they say CE. So the Christian era, and they give you a date. Their dating system dates from the time they left Egypt. So that's why a Jewish calendar is roughly 1,500 years older than our calendar. They begin from the time they left Egypt in about 1445 BC. Okay, so just to remind you that if you write AD and BC, AD goes before the number, BC goes after the number. Why is that? Because when you say AD, you're literally saying in the year of our Lord, 2021. So if you don't say 2021 AD, you say AD 2021. BC goes after the number. So it would be 756 before Christ. So what I'm not assuming is that we think numbers are getting bigger. We're moving away from the time of Christ. On the other side of Christ's birth, the numbers get smaller. So when you start a ministry like he did in about 627, 586, you have to subtract 627 from 586 from 627 to get how many years that is. Okay, I think we mostly know that, but I never want to assume stuff when I begin teaching because I don't know what you know and what you don't know. So in 627, he starts to prophesy roughly. It was the 13th year of Josiah. Josiah is the last godly king of Judah. Now let's back up a little bit and make sure we get our history right. So he begins in 627, 100 years before, in 722, Assyria had wiped out the northern 10 tribes. So 100 years before Jeremiah, there is no more Israel. The northern 10 tribes never had a godly king, never had a godly ruler. They had Ahab. They had some wicked rulers. And the famous prophets against them were like Elijah and Elisha. Those kind of guys ministered to the 10 northern tribes. So 100 years before, the majority of Jewish members, the ethnic group of the Jews, was dispersed through the Assyrian kingdom. Assyria was, let's see, okay, how can we do with the map? Okay, outstanding. If I get the right, no, you just turned it off. Okay, so which one is, oh no. Are you clicking it off and I'm clicking it, or am I doing that, am I messing up? Okay, there we go. So Assyria, so this is modern day Iraq right here, okay? This is modern day Iran, modern day Jordan, modern day Syria. Assyria was up here. So I had members of my church in Arizona who were born in Nineveh. Anybody ever heard of Nineveh? Except today we call it Mosul. So Mosul is just a couple miles away from the remnants of the ancient city of Nineveh. Nineveh was the capital of Assyria. Assyria ruled this part of the world. What we're going to find in Jeremiah is Assyria is in the middle between the great power of Egypt and the rising power of Babylon. Okay? The most famous battle is going to take place here at Carchemish, and we'll eventually talk about that battle that changed the world for 200 years, that particular battle. I always say as a military officer, you always want to be the away team in war. Ask Germany how it worked out to be the home team in World War II. You never want to be the home team in war. Always want to be the away team. Always. So when Egypt is going to fight Babylon, they don't want to fight in Egypt and they don't want to fight in Babylon. Where are they going to fight? Like here in Israel. Israel was always the place. So in those days when you fought a war, you didn't carry a logistics train of food. If you remember the death angel kills over 180,000 Assyrians in one night. Do you remember that with Hezekiah? Do you remember that story? How do you feed? So one of our other sayings is amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics. Amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics. So I don't think, okay, what are tactics? How are you going to string an arrow and shoot an arrow, right? That's tactics. Logistics is how am I going to feed that guy? That's logistics. So how do you feed up 200,000 Assyrians? Well, they didn't have refrigerators. They didn't have railroad cars. They didn't have airplanes. How are they going to feed? Oh, they steal the food of the people in whose land they live. So Israel was always being pillaged by every invading army. So when the Egyptians march from Egypt up to the Battle of Carchemish, which we'll talk about eventually, they take all the food from Israel on their way. So the Jews are starving because they take all their food. That's why when you stop and think, I'll chase a little bit of rabbit here. Look at where God puts Israel. 3 continents: Europe, Asia, Africa. He puts this little teeny nation in the middle where they become a speed bump on every major war. So when Egypt, they go through Israel, because this is desert, right? The way you would march is up the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. That's Israel. You would have to have a good supply line. You'd have to have a good communication line. So you would want to subjugate Israel. When Assyria wanted to conquer Egypt, they marched through Israel. When Babylon wants to conquer Egypt, they don't come across here. That's desert. I've been there. Oh my goodness, it makes Arizona look well watered. I've been here, okay? I've actually driven from Bahrain, which is here, all the way over to Jeddah, which is here. I've driven that. It is, when you say desert, you mean desert. So you went up the rivers and you came in from the north. That's why you read in the Old Testament, the enemy comes from the north. If you came from the south, it was Egypt. If you came from the north, that was the way you entered the Holy Land. You came from the north because that's where food was. That was where water was. All of those things. So God puts Israel, if you think about it, in the middle. So when Alexander the Great comes from Greece and he attacks this way, what does he do? He comes down this way to conquer Egypt and build the city there on the coast. Names after himself, Alexandria, right there at the river Nile's delta. When Rome wants to come and conquer the Middle East, where do they go? They come in 40 BC and they conquer Israel. So, in other words, God put Israel in the middle. Why? This is really good for us to understand as an application for us, because it is so good. It's so rich. Why does God put Israel in the middle of pagans? The same reason he put you in the middle of pagans. So stop and think about it. Why did God put you in the middle of pagans? Remember what Jesus in his high priestly prayer in John 17 says? He says, Lord, I pray that they will be in the world, but not of the world. So God puts us in the world, but not of the world for two reasons. To display his glory and for us to learn dependence upon him. Now stop and think about that. God puts you in your job, me in my neighborhood, me going, why? To be the visible manifestation of his essence, to display his glory. That's what the word glory means, right? The visible manifestation of one's essence. And to be dependent upon him. I can't go into a pagan society and say, okay, you know what, I'm gonna be large and in charge. No, my belief system in America is slowly becoming the minority belief system, isn't it? Okay, so how do we handle that? Well, the same way God put Israel in the middle. And it's interesting that if you look at the topography of Israel itself right here, down the middle of Israel, right there, it's like a tent pole. Jerusalem sits at the top, and it falls away to the Mediterranean Sea, and it falls away to the Jordan River. So from Jericho to Jerusalem is 17 miles, but it's a 3,500-foot climb. So it's a little bit like going out of Denver and going 17 miles up I-70 going west, right? And I mean, you're just like this. And that was the way from Jericho. So the Dead Sea is the lowest point on earth. Right here, the lowest point on earth. Jerusalem is almost 3,000 feet, and it's about 30 miles away. So it's a climb that looks like this. So he puts Jerusalem at the tippy top of this tent pole, if you think geographically. You can stand over here in Jordan today on the same ridge line that Moses looked into the promised land but couldn't go in. You remember that story, right? He couldn't go in. You can stand there. I have stood there, and from that point on a clear day, 70 miles away is Jerusalem. You can see Jerusalem from Jordan today because the topography. So he puts Jerusalem on this tent pole, as it were, geographically, so that if you were going to have a war and you were going to go up the coast, you had to go up to Jerusalem and conquer the Jerusalem, or they would have, if you didn't, then the Jews could come out of the mountains and cut your supply chain, going north or south. So everybody that traded, everybody that went by, they had to go to Jerusalem. So the temple in Jerusalem was 45 feet tall. And it was made of white, so the sun would reflect off of it. God made it that way so people would be drawn to it, to reflect his glory. But he also put them in the middle because they were never going to have an army big enough to fight the Egyptians, to fight the Babylonians, to fight the Greeks, to fight the Romans, to fight the Assyrians. They had to depend on him. And that's going to be the theme of Jeremiah's message, is stop depending on yourself. And I'll come back. The reason I'm telling you this now in introduction is we're going to come back to it and back to it and back to it in his messages. He's going to do a word play on Egypt. And he's going to say, the Egyptians are like a broken reed, a broken papyri. So paper, what they used for paper was grown in the Nile. And they would take this stalk, papyri, and they would lay it out, and then they would beat it down, and that's how they made paper, papyri. And Jeremiah does a word play on Egypt because they were depending on Egypt to protect them from Babylon, and he's saying to them, don't depend on the people that make paper. This can't stop nothing. Don't depend on this, depend on God. Obey God. Do what God says. Admit that you've sinned and you're going to go through the chastening of God through the Babylonians. Depend on God and surrender to the Babylonians. Don't depend on paper. Depend on God. They didn't want to hear that. How many of us don't want to hear that message? Well, I'll depend on my IRA. Nothing wrong with having an IRA. That's a good thing to do. Plan for your future. But I depend on God. Well, I'm going to depend on my house. I'm going to depend on my kids. Well, those are great things. Those are wonderful to have kids, wonderful to have a house. But our dependence should be on God. There's so much application as we get into this if you understand the history. So geography and history are everything. So let me keep going. Judah has Josiah as their king. So Josiah begins reigning when he's 8. He's 8. His great-granddaddy Manasseh reigned for 55 years, was the most wicked king Judah ever had. Now remember, Judah is just the southern two tribes, Judah and Benjamin. We get our name Jew from Judah. After the Babylonian captivity, it's Judah that comes back, and we get Jew from the descendants of Judah because the 10 northern tribes are only known to God today. They will come back in our theology. They will come back during the tribulation, and God will call 12,000 from each of those 10 tribes. That's in the book of Revelation. But we get the name Jew from Judah. The Jews that we see today are descendants of the tribe of Judah. That's where we get the name. So Josiah starts ministering, or he starts to be king, and the temple is destroyed. His dad, Ammon, reigned for 2 years, and he was so vile, God killed him. So when we get into Jeremiah, we're going to find that the temple has been turned into a brothel. It is a haven for prostitutes. The prostitutes are in the temple through Manasseh and Amnon, and the scripture is lost. If you remember the story, we're going to find it as we cross-reference Jeremiah and the passages in Chronicles and Kings. We're going to find that later in Josiah's life, they are in the temple fixing it up, and they find, you remember? They found this. Now, I'm going to stop and chase another rabbit. In the life of the Davidic kingdom, there was a king before Josiah, if you remember, when wicked Queen Athaliah wipes out all the seed royal. Remember, she comes in and she wipes. There's only one baby left. All of God's promises came down for Jesus to be born, the tribe and lineage of David. All of God's promises came down to one little baby. Do you realize that our whole Old Testament came down to one manuscript that God providentially preserved in a brothel? Are you tracking with what I'm teaching you? everything for 57 years, Manasseh and Amon didn't worship God, set the temple up as a brothel, and when Josiah goes and starts moving the weeds and taking the cobwebs out, they come to him and they say, we found a Bible. Now, he's been king for many years. We'll get to it. He's been king for many years, and they start reading to him what they're supposed to be doing, and he realizes for 65 years, at minimum for 65 years, they haven't obeyed one thing God said, and he tears his clothes. And he's horrified because the promises of destruction must come because of his father and his grandfather and his great-grandfather and how they had behaved. You stop and think about God kept his word by preserving the Old Testament in a closet in a brothel. God kept his word by preserving a baby when Athaliah wanted to destroy every heir so she could be queen and there would be no heir. Great. As I go through this, I hope we make a lot of applications to us. If God keeps his word about preserving his word, if God keeps his word about preserving the Davidic line, God's going to keep his word to us. God's going to keep his word to us. So, Josiah is going to reign for 31 years. Josiah is going to die at the age of 39 in a battle at Megiddo with Egypt. The nation of Judah was gripped by idolatry. I've already talked to you about Manasseh and Amnon. It's not until Josiah's 18th year that they're going to have a great revival. You can find that in 2 Kings 22. They rediscover the law, as I just mentioned, and Josiah embarks on an attempt to reform, and Jeremiah helps him in that. Remember that Jeremiah has started prophesying a few years before they discover the law. A few years before they discover the law. They're going to discover the law when Josiah is about 25, 26. And Jeremiah is going to start prophesying about 5 years before that. So it's very likely that it's Jeremiah's prophesying at the beginning of his ministry that urges Josiah to go into the temple and start cleaning up the temple. Jeremiah and Josiah are probably about a year apart in age, with Josiah being about a year older than Jeremiah. Jeremiah most likely begins his prophesying when he's about 20. And he even says in chapter 1, he's just a child. And that Hebrew word carries with it a term of under the age of 21. So we don't know exactly how old Jeremiah was, but we know he wasn't more than 21 when he begins to prophesy. So stop and think, and you couldn't be a priest in the temple till you were 35. So when Jeremiah pushes back against God as we get into chapter 1 eventually, one of his pushbacks is, I'm way too young. No one's going to listen to me. No one's going to pay attention to me. Josiah succeeded. I'm going to go back over this again with you multiple times. Josiah succeeded in making Israel, Judah, conform externally. Jeremiah preached to their heart. Change, don't honor me with your lips, love me from your heart. So you had this, I would call it the Christian school. You know, Josiah's making them behave. And Jeremiah is preaching in chapel, but love God with your heart. You can do all the externals, but if you don't love him with your heart, it doesn't matter. Doesn't that sound like Jesus? Doesn't that sound like Jesus' ministry? You love him, you do all these Pharisaical things, but you don't love him from your heart, it doesn't count. We can do the same thing with our kids, can't we? You know, you can rear a kid. It's always amazing to me that young people that grow up in the same home, same youth pastor, same church, they went to a Christian school, same Christian school. If they go to Christian camp, same Christian camp, and they can be 2 years apart in age, and one kid goes that way and one kid goes this way. Same parents, same everything. You know what? Because I can teach them, here's what you have to do, but ultimately that child chooses from their heart who they will love. Yes? So internationally, I've already kind of explained this. The Assyrian Empire had dominated, so that's here, what we would call northern Iraq and northern Syria today. The Syrian Empire had dominated the world, but it was getting old. It had been doing that for about 250 years, and there was a rising power. We're going to call it the Neo-Babylonian. In other words, the new Babylonian, because there had been a former Babylonian power 1,000 years before. But there is what we would call today southern Iraq. There's a power here. And Egypt has been under the boot heel of Assyria. But what we're going to see is, think strategically and geopolitically, Egypt wants to keep Assyria in power as a buffer between Babylon and themselves. So they're going to want to move their northern boundary from here, Egypt, all the way up here, 600 miles away. Because if I can move my boundary, we'll do war as an away team, not a home team. Okay? Yeah, if you don't understand this political intrigue, when we get into the scripture text, you won't understand the fight back and forth between what's going on in Jeremiah's life. Okay? So, about the time Josiah comes to rule, there's battles going on between the Babylonians and the Assyrians, okay? He consolidated his empire, the king of Babylon, in 616, and then the Babylonians, along with what is the modern day Persians, we call them the Medes. They were called the Medes. They get together, these guys get together and really sock it to the Assyrians. Just wipe them out, really mess them over. Egypt, sensing that there's an opportunity, is going to move north to help the Assyrians prop them up. And this is where Josiah is going to die. Right here at Megiddo, Josiah takes his army out to stop the Egyptians from going after the Assyrians, because in his mind and the Jewish mind, if we stop the Egyptians and the Babylonians take over, he was an ally of the Babylonians, because the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And the Assyrians had been slaughtering the Jews by the millions for 200 years. The Assyrians invented crucifixion. They had deported the northern 10 tribes 100 years before. So the Assyrians were hated by the Jews. So he goes up here to Megiddo in 609 and attempts to stop Pharaoh. Pharaoh kills him, goes on to the Battle of Carchemish up here, and Egyptians are wiped out. As the Egyptians retreat, the Egyptians put a proxy king, one of Josiah's sons, in power, who now favors the Egyptians, and this is where Jeremiah is going to go out of favor. Because he's going to be prophesying, surrender to the Babylonians. They are God's arm of discipline against you for your wickedness. Surrender. Okay? So, let me skip over a lot of stuff I wrote because I'm explaining it to you. I don't need to read it. I don't think I need to. So we'll get to it. It goes back and forth through the whole book, because there's going to be an Egyptian Jewish king that favors the Egyptians, and then the Babylonians are going to come. So this king is put in place in 609. By 605, the Babylonians come and they put their own king in place. And that's 605 is the first deportation. That's when Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are taken as teenagers from Jerusalem here to Babylon. That's what's going on at that point. Okay. I've given you a ton of history. I hope I'm doing it in a way that it's not just flying out over your head. I hope I'm giving it to you in a way that you're saying, okay, I'm processing this. Okay, I will get into the text. Trust me. But if you don't, more bad preaching has come out of Jeremiah, because you're not standing in the sandals of the people who heard Jeremiah's prophecies. You have to stand in their sandals or you don't get the prophecies. So the prophecies of 70 weeks or 70 years of captivity that Daniel's going to talk about later in his book comes from Jeremiah. Great verses like, my thoughts for you are good and not evil, Jeremiah 29:11. There are so many verses that you know that come out of the prophecies of Jeremiah that it's a very, very rich study. So let me take a step back and pause for a minute. Any questions? And let me just tell you this, there are no dumb questions. There are just dumb people that don't ask questions they don't know anything about. That, in other words, they're too ashamed to ask a question. There are no dumb questions. There are no dumb questions, okay? Any question? I've got about 7 more minutes. Okay, yes, go ahead. 5 according to modern math and our postmodern world. I mean, I've literally read articles about that 2 + 2 = 4 is a fact of white supremacy. I have literally read that. Yeah, when a nation turns its back on God, it turns its back on common sense. Yeah, go ahead.
So what is Nebuchadnezzar?
Great question. So in 626, Nebuchadnezzar's father, his name is Nabopolassar is his name. Nabopolassar is going to die in, I believe, 609, just of natural causes. His son, so 609 is right after the Battle of Carchemish. And that's when the Egyptians lose, the Assyrians get completely obliterated, and they retreat back here and set up their fake king, their new Jewish king that will be their vassal. Nebuchadnezzar spends 4 years going back here and consolidating his power in Babylon before he prepares his army to march on Judah and take the rest of that. So Nebuchadnezzar comes on the scene right after 609 when Nabopolassar, his father, dies of natural causes. Some say he was poisoned. It's, who knows? Good question. But Nabopolassar is the creator of the Babylonian kingdom. It's Nebuchadnezzar that expands it. And it will be his grandson, right, that's going to be the handwriting on the wall. It's going to be Nabopolassar's great-grandson. So this great Babylonian empire only lasts for 4 generations. And then it's going to be wiped out by the Iranians. So think this way. Stop and think. The Iraqis and the Iranians have been fighting for 3,000 years. Right? I mean, how long have the French and the Germans been fighting? Go back to the days of Rome, right? So when I would talk like this to senior military leaders, I would say, do you understand that we're in the middle of a fight that's been going on for like 3,500 years? A great comment was made to me once by a guide in Europe, and we were on a USO trip over to Paris. My wife and I were from Germany, and he made this really insightful comment. He said, Americans think that 200 miles, driving 200 miles is nothing. Right? I mean, how many of you go up into the mountains just to look around in the summertime? Or whatever, right? I mean, we don't think 200 miles, I'm from Arizona. I mean, we would do a weekend trip to San Diego, and it's like 700 miles round trip. We wouldn't even think of 3-day weekend. We'd go over there just to see the ocean, see water, because we don't have any water, right? I mean, 700 miles is like, and he said, to Americans, 200 miles is nothing. To Europeans, 200 miles is 5 countries. I mean, if you drive from Paris to Berlin, which is 700 miles, 600 miles, you go through Luxembourg, Holland, Belgium. You go through multiple countries. Then he said this. He said, and then to Americans, 200 years is forever. To Europeans, 200 years is yesterday. So I'm always, when we say 400 years, for our American mind, I always say 400 years was when Pilgrims hit Massachusetts, 1620. 500 years was when the Reformation started. We think, oh my goodness, that's forever. No, it's not. That's yesterday compared to the Persians and the Babylonians fighting each other, who now we call the Iranians and the Iraqis. They've been fighting each other for generations, and they remember your great-great-great-great-great-great-grandpa killed my great-great-great-great-grandpa in a battle, and so therefore I'm going to kill all your cousins. We don't understand that. Okay? So that's great question. I chased the rabbit, but that's little Bonnie Foo-Foo popping through the forest, and we'll like pop the little rabbit on her head. Yes?
Who are the Chaldeans?
Great question. So the Chaldeans, Chaldea, do you see the word right there? Okay. The Chaldeans would what we would call today the Iraqis who live in southern Iraq. So think Baghdad, think Basra, think Najaf, if you remember back to when we were invading Iraq, those cities, that's the Chaldeans. In fact, Babylon, the ruins of Babylon are about 40 miles south of Baghdad. So a lot of our Christian military members, when they were in Iraq, went and have pictures of themselves in the ruins of Babylon. And it's interesting, you know, you have the Old Testament prophets like Isaiah saying that jackals, Babylon at the zenith of its power, right? And it's prophesied jackals will live there. Well, today jackals live there. It'd be like if I promised New York City that jackals would live in New York City. And yet in 1,500 years or 500 years, and in fact in that prophecy, it was within about 200 years jackals were living there. Because when the Medes and the Persians come in out of modern day Iran and they wipe out Babylon, they wipe it out. They take Daniel captive down here to Susa, which becomes their capital. So Daniel and the lion's den actually happens in Persia. It doesn't happen in Babylon because it's a different nation that's reigning and ruling. So the Chaldeans think Babylonians. They're the same. It's the same. Does that make sense? Okay, good. Outstanding. Well, I see it's 10 o'clock. We didn't open the Bible. I understand that. So you think, oh my goodness, I went to a Baptist church and didn't open the Bible. Trust me, we'll absolutely get there. But I want you to understand the applications I'm going to make to us as we study Jeremiah for the next year. If you don't understand the topography and the history, you won't get how incredible those prophecies are. You won't get how meaningful they are. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. The answer won't be quick, though, I promise you. The question can be...
And Nehemiah, contemporary Jeremiah.
Great question. Nehemiah is 100 years after Jeremiah. So let me read to you. Let me see, I wrote them all down. Let me read to you. Let me get them here. I've got all, okay. So let me give you for your who lived at the time of Jeremiah. Okay, Zephaniah, Obadiah, Huldah. We read about Huldah in different scripture passages. Ezekiel, Daniel, Habakkuk, Nahum, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. Those are all people living the same time Jeremiah is living. So you get an idea, oh my goodness, that last 50 years till the destruction of Jerusalem, and then the 40 years after that, a lot of the Bible prophecies take place in that. And that's another reason to study Jeremiah, because he's the longest. He spans all of them. Okay, great question. Yeah, so get this in your head too. There are 3 deportations. 605, that's when Daniel, Shadrach, and Meshach go. They're hostages. They're the teenagers. They're related to the king. So if I take your cousins, you won't rebel against me. That's the thought. 605, then 587, that's when Ezekiel goes. So Ezekiel and Jeremiah are buddies. There's 18 different references to Ezekiel and Jeremiah writing back and forth. So Jeremiah's in Jerusalem, Ezekiel's in Babylon. They're going to write back and forth. They are contemporaries, okay? Then 586 is when the city is utterly wiped out. Then when they come back, there are 3 returns. So that's why when I preached the sermon on Palm Sunday, where I said the return that starts the 69 weeks of the 70 weeks, and it's the 69 weeks, that return is not the first return. That clock started on the second return. Okay, so there's 3 deportations and there's 3 returns. So that sometimes gets our chronology, we get that mixed up as well. So I'll be talking to you about that. Yeah, yes?
So the first deportation was affected through Assyria?
No, it was a good question. So Assyria, by the time of the first deportation, the Battle of Carchemish happens in 609. Assyria is obliterated. The Egyptians are the allies of Assyria, and the Babylonian and the Medes wiped them out. So 605, 4 years later, Nebuchadnezzar takes the rule from his father. He comes down in 605 and he overthrows the Jewish king that Pharaoh put in place, and he puts a Babylonian Jewish king in place. That's why when you read the text, you see Jehoiakim, and you see Jehoiakim, and you see Zedekiah, you see all these different kings. That's because when the Egyptians were in power, they put a vassal in place that was on their side, and when the Babylonians came back, they put a vassal king in place that was on their side. So 609 is when the Assyrians get wiped out. 605 is when the Babylonians come, and that's when they take Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to Babylon. And that's where the book of Daniel begins, in 605. Good deal. Okay. I trust this is going to be enjoyable for you. I trust I didn't bore you with too much history or military stuff or whatever, but I trust that you're thinking we will get into the texts. Okay, trust me on that one. Okay, I'm about 5 minutes over. That may happen more often than you think. So anyway, God bless you. We'll start back in 10 minutes. Get up and stretch your legs.